Imagine a king so desperate for an heir that he married a woman he'd never met, a princess from a distant land who couldn't speak his language, couldn't bear his children, and would watch helplessly as he paraded mistress after mistress through the palace halls. This is the story of Charles II of England, a man who returned from exile to reclaim his throne only to discover that the crown's greatest burden wasn't power. It was duty. A royal wedding orchestrated for political gain would set in motion a chain of events that would tear apart not just a marriage, but an entire empire. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me which historical figure you want to hear about next. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.
The year was 1660, and Charles Stuart had learned to sleep with one eye open. For 9 years he'd wandered Europe like a ghost, a king without a kingdom, dining at tables where he wasn't truly welcome, wearing smiles that never reached his eyes. His father, Charles I, had been beheaded in the courtyard of Whitehall Palace, his blood staining the snow as the crowd roared. The boy who watched his father die became a man who understood that survival meant compromise, charm, and careful calculation. "Your Majesty," his advisor whispered one cold morning in Brussels, "Parliament has sent word. They want you back." Charles didn't move. He'd heard promises before, empty words from desperate men, but this time was different. Oliver Cromwell, the man who'd turned England into a joyless republic, was dead. The experiment had failed. The people wanted their king. When Charles II finally stepped onto English soil at Dover, crowds erupted. They threw flowers, they wept, they screamed his name until their voices broke. He was 30 years old, tall and dark-haired, with eyes that had seen too much. As he rode through the streets of London, waving to the masses, a single thought echoed in his mind: "I will never be powerless again." But power, he would soon discover, came with a price. His advisers gathered around him like vultures circling prey. "You need an heir, Your Majesty," they insisted. "The throne must be secured." Charles knew what that meant: marriage. Not for love. Love was a luxury kings couldn't afford. Marriage for alliance, for money, for the stability of the realm. "Catherine of Braganza," his chancellor announced, sliding a miniature portrait across the table. "Princess of Portugal, brings a dowry of 2 million crowns, trading rights in the East Indies and the ports of Tangier and Bombay." Charles studied the painted face. Dark hair, solemn eyes, a mouth that seemed uncertain whether to smile or not. She was 23 years old and had spent her entire life in a Portuguese convent, preparing to be a bride of Christ. Now she would be his bride instead. "Does she speak English?" "She will learn, Your Majesty." "Does she know anything about England?" A pause. "She will learn." Charles set down the portrait and stared out the window at the Thames, dark and churning below. He thought of Barbara Villiers, his mistress, the woman who made him laugh, who challenged him, who knew exactly how to make him forget the weight of the crown. Barbara was already pregnant with his child. Everyone knew it. Everyone pretended not to. "Make the arrangements," he said quietly. His advisor beamed. "Excellent choice, Your Majesty. This marriage will secure England's future." "But what about mine?" Charles wanted to ask. Instead, he nodded and dismissed them all. That night, alone in his chambers, Charles poured himself wine and wondered what kind of woman would leave everything she'd ever known to marry a stranger. He wondered if she was afraid. He wondered if she knew what she was walking into. In Portugal, Catherine of Braganza sat in her mother's palace, staring at a portrait of her future husband. The English king looked confident, even arrogant, with his dark curls and knowing smile. "You will be Queen of England," her mother said, gripping her shoulders. "You will give England an heir. This is your destiny." Catherine's hands trembled as she touched the painted canvas. She didn't speak English. She'd never been outside Portugal. The only men she'd ever known were priests and servants. And now she was expected to share a bed with this stranger, to produce children, to navigate a foreign court filled with people who would judge her every move. "What if I fail?" she whispered. Her mother's grip tightened. "Failure is not an option." The ships were prepared. The contracts were signed. 2 kingdoms had agreed on the terms. All that remained was for the bride and groom to meet. What Catherine didn't know was that her future husband's mistress had already claimed the apartments meant for the queen and had no intention of leaving.
Catherine of Braganza arrived in England on a rainy May afternoon in 1662, seasick and terrified. The journey had been brutal, weeks of violent storms that tossed her ship like a toy. She'd spent most of the voyage in her cabin, clutching a rosary and praying to saints whose names the English had probably forgotten. When she finally saw the coastline, she wanted to weep with relief. But relief died the moment she was escorted to her chambers. Charles met her in Portsmouth, in a private ceremony so rushed it felt like a transaction. She wore a Portuguese gown with a massive farthingale that made her look like a child playing dress-up. Her dark hair was styled in an old-fashioned way that made the English ladies whisper and giggle behind their fans. Charles bowed. "Your Majesty," he said in Portuguese, carefully rehearsed, badly pronounced. Catherine curtsied so low she nearly toppled. When she looked up, her eyes met his, and for a brief moment she saw something that might have been kindness. "I thank you," she stammered in broken English. The wedding was a blur. 2 ceremonies, one Catholic for her, one Anglican for England, vows she didn't fully understand, a ring on her finger that felt too heavy, and then it was done. She was Queen of England. That night, as servants prepared her for the wedding bed, Catherine's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She'd been raised in a convent. No one had explained what would happen. Her ladies dressed her in a thin nightgown and led her to the royal bedchamber, where Charles waited. He was gentle. She would remember that. Not passionate, not tender, but considerate. He spoke softly, moved slowly, seemed aware of her fear. When it was over, he kissed her forehead and left her alone in the dark. That wasn't so terrible, she told herself. We can make this work. She had no idea what was waiting for her in London. When Catherine arrived at Whitehall Palace, she discovered that the Queen's apartments, her apartments, were occupied by Barbara Villiers, the King's mistress, the woman who'd given him 2 children already, the woman who laughed too loudly, dressed too provocatively, and looked at Charles like he belonged to her. "Your Majesty," Barbara said with a curtsy that was just barely respectful, "I hope you find the palace to your liking." She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone, the smile that didn't reach the eyes, the way the other courtiers watched, waiting for her reaction. Where's my room?" Catherine asked in halting English. "Oh, I'm sure they'll find you something suitable," Barbara replied sweetly. That night, Catherine locked herself in a borrowed chamber and cried until her throat was raw. She'd crossed an ocean to be humiliated, to be second, to be the wife in name only, while another woman held the king's heart. But Catherine of Braganza had survived the Portuguese court, where politics were played with poison and daggers. She was not as helpless as she looked. The next morning, she requested an audience with Charles. He arrived looking uncomfortable, already knowing what this was about. "Your Majesty," Catherine said carefully, each word rehearsed with her Portuguese ladies, "that woman, Barbara Villiers, she must go." Charles sighed. "Catherine, she am my wife. I am queen. She disrespects me. She disrespects you." "I cannot dismiss her," Charles said quietly. "Cannot or will not." The room went silent. Charles looked at this small woman who'd crossed an ocean for him, who stood trembling but defiant in her unfashionable dress, and he felt something he hadn't expected: guilt. "Barbara, she was there when I had nothing," he said. "She gave me children when—" He stopped himself. "When you couldn't," Catherine heard in the silence. She felt the words like a slap. She'd been married mere weeks. How could he already blame her for not producing an heir? "I see," she said coldly. "Then I understand my position." "Catherine, please!" "May I be excused, Your Majesty?" Charles wanted to reach for her, to explain, to make her understand that politics and survival had made him into someone who compartmentalized love and duty. But he didn't. He just nodded. As Catherine left, she held her head high. The courtiers watched, whispering. Barbara smirked from across the gallery. But Catherine had learned something crucial. Her husband was weak, not in power, but in will. He couldn't say no. He needed to be liked, to be loved, to avoid conflict, and if there was one thing Catherine knew how to do, it was endure. What she didn't know was that Barbara Villiers had already begun plotting to make sure the Queen would never ever give England an heir.
Years passed like a slow drowning. Catherine learned English. She learned to smile at court functions while courtiers gossiped about her inability to produce children. She learned to ignore the parade of mistresses, not just Barbara, but Louise de Carouel, Nell Gwynn, and countless others whose names she refused to remember. She also learned that she loved Charles. It happened slowly, against her will. She loved the way he played with his spaniels, the way he walked through his laboratories examining telescopes and curiosities, the way he could discuss philosophy and science with the same passion other men reserved for war. She loved his laugh, rare and genuine. She loved the man he could have been if the crown hadn't broken him first. But love, she discovered, was a curse when it wasn't returned. Charles was kind to her. He visited her chambers occasionally, performed his duty without passion, and then left. He gave her gifts, beautiful gowns, jewels, apartments in each palace, everything except what she wanted: his presence, his attention, his fidelity. One morning in 1663, Catherine felt a strange flutter in her belly. Then came the nausea, the exhaustion, the tender breasts. She didn't dare hope. She'd been through this before, phantom pregnancies born of desperate wish and crushing pressure, but this time felt different. "Your Majesty?" her physician confirmed. "You are with child." Catherine wept. She sent word to Charles immediately. He came to her chambers, actually smiling, and took her hands. "This is wonderful news," he said, and she saw genuine joy in his eyes. For 3 months, Catherine walked on air. The court treated her with new respect. Even Barbara seemed subdued. Charles visited more often, asked about her health, placed his hand on her belly to feel for movement. "What shall we name him?" Catherine asked one afternoon, allowing herself to dream. "Him," Charles teased. "How do you know it's not a girl?" "A mother knows," she said, smiling. But at 4 months, the cramping started. Then the bleeding. Catherine knew what was happening even before the physicians confirmed it. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," the doctor whispered. "The child is lost." Catherine turned her face to the wall and didn't speak for 3 days. Charles came once, stood at her bedside looking helpless, and then left. Within a week, he was back in Barbara's bed. It happened 2 more times over the next 4 years, each pregnancy ending in heartbreak, each loss driving a deeper wedge between them. "Perhaps Your Majesty should consider accepting certain realities,"
her chief lady-in-waiting suggested delicately after the third miscarriage. Catherine understood. She was failing. The one duty she had, the only reason she'd been brought to England, and she couldn't fulfill it. Meanwhile, Barbara Villiers and the other mistresses produced healthy children one after another. Charles doted on them, gave them titles, showered them with affection. The children Catherine couldn't give him flourished in other women's wombs. The humiliation was complete. In 1665, the Great Plague swept through London. Catherine volunteered to stay in the city, helping tend to the sick even as courtiers fled to safety. She didn't care if she died. What did she have to live for? Charles, surprisingly, stayed too. They worked side by side in ways they never had before, visiting plague houses, comforting the dying, organizing relief efforts. One night, exhausted and covered in grime, they sat together in an empty palace. "Why did you stay?" Charles asked. "Because they are my people too, and because I needed to do something that mattered." Charles looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the silent, defeated woman who haunted the palace, but the brave girl who'd crossed an ocean alone. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything." Catherine wanted to scream at him, to rage about the mistresses, the humiliation, the loneliness, but she was too tired. "Sorry doesn't change anything," she said. The plague ended, the court returned, and with it, the mistresses. But something had shifted in Catherine. She had spent years trying to be what everyone wanted, the perfect queen, the dutiful wife, the mother of an heir. She'd failed at all of it. So she stopped trying. She cultivated her own circle of friends. She patronized artists and musicians. She introduced tea drinking to England and turned it into a fashionable ritual that would outlast the monarchy itself. She became powerful in her own right, not through children, but through influence. And Charles, watching from a distance, realized what he had lost. But by then, it was too late, because Catherine had discovered something that would shake the very foundations of the throne.
The year was 1678, and England was tearing itself apart. The Popish plot, a supposed Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Charles and place his brother James on the throne, had the country in a frenzy. Parliament demanded that James, a Catholic convert, be excluded from succession. The people rioted in the streets, and at the center of it all stood Catherine of Braganza, Portuguese, Catholic, childless. "They're saying you're part of the plot," Charles told her one evening, his voice tight with worry. "They want to put you on trial for treason." Catherine looked up from her embroidery, utterly calm. "And do you believe I plot against you?" "Of course not." "Then it doesn't matter what they say." But it did matter. Parliament was screaming for her blood. Preachers called her the whore of Babylon. Mobs gathered outside the palace, chanting for the Catholic queen to be sent back to Portugal. Charles stood before Parliament and did something he'd never done before. He fought for her. "The Queen is entirely innocent," he declared, his voice ringing through Westminster Hall. "I will dissolve this Parliament before I allow harm to come to her. She has been nothing but loyal, faithful, and dutiful, everything I have not been." The admission shocked the chamber into silence. For the first time in their marriage, Charles chose Catherine, not out of duty, not out of political necessity, but because it was right. The plot eventually unraveled, revealed as fiction. Catherine was exonerated. But the damage to the monarchy was done. England was divided between Protestant and Catholic, king and parliament, tradition and change. And Charles finally understood the cost of his wedding. By marrying a Catholic princess, he'd sown the seeds of division. By failing to produce a legitimate Protestant heir, he'd created a succession crisis. By parading his mistresses and illegitimate children before the world, he'd made the monarchy look weak and corrupt. The marriage that was supposed to save the empire had helped destroy it. One evening, years later, Catherine found Charles in his laboratory, staring at nothing. "Are you well?" she asked. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about how different everything could have been if I'd been better." Catherine sat beside him. They were older now. She was in her 40s, he approaching 50. The passion and drama had faded, replaced by something stranger, companionship. "We cannot change the past," she said. "No, but I can tell you now what I should have said years ago." He turned to face her. "You deserved better than me. You deserved love, not duty. Children, not loneliness. A husband, not a stranger who happened to wear a crown." Catherine felt tears on her cheeks. "And you deserved a wife who could give you an heir." "I had everything I needed," Charles said. "I was just too foolish to see it." In 1685, Charles II died. His last words were about his mistresses, asking his brother to care for them and their children. Even at the end, he couldn't help himself. But before he died, he took Catherine's hand. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I already have," she said. Catherine of Braganza remained in England for 3 more years before finally returning to Portugal. She never remarried, she never had children, but she became regent of Portugal, ruling with wisdom and strength, proving that she'd always had the power within her. She'd just been in the wrong kingdom. The crown passed to James II, Charles's Catholic brother. Within 3 years, he was deposed in the Glorious Revolution, driven into exile just as Charles had been decades before. The cycle repeated. And it all traced back to that wedding, the political marriage that brought in a Catholic queen, produced no heirs, and set England on a path towards civil strife that would last for generations. Catherine lived to be 67. On her deathbed, someone asked if she regretted going to England. "Regret?" she said. "No, I learned who I was there. I learned that I didn't need a crown to be a queen. I didn't need children to leave a legacy. And I didn't need Charles to be whole." She smiled. "England taught me that the only person who can complete you is yourself." The royal wedding that was supposed to secure an empire instead revealed its fundamental weakness. Charles II and Catherine of Braganza's marriage was a tragedy, not because they didn't love each other, but because they tried to build a kingdom on duty instead of trust, on politics instead of partnership. In the end, the crown destroyed them both, but Catherine rose from the ashes. If this story moved you, drop a like and subscribe for more incredible historical tales. And tell me in the comments, can duty and love ever truly coexist? I'll see you in the next one.